Charles Darwin was born in 1809. Perhaps more than any other thinker of the 19th century, his ideas have influenced the course of science and intellectual thought throughout the world. He formulated his ideas about evolution during a 5-year voyage on a Royal Naval ship, the HMS Beagle. He was hired on as ship's naturalist. He saw the importance of biological variation within a species. He recognized that sexual reproduction increased variation, but did not yet know why. He did not come up with the idea of evolution. That had long been in the air, not very well accepted. He himself did not accept the concept of evolution when he stepped foot on that ship, but 5 years later, when he got off that ship in London, he was convinced that evolution was an active biological process. I had the honor a few years ago of visiting Cambridge University, where I dined at the same table that Charles Darwin had dined at, and was even added to a list of names that included Charles Darwin's for guests who had been presented with a bottle of wine. Darwin formulated the theory of natural selection. This is important to distinguish from the theory of evolution. The term the theory of evolution is a misunderstanding. Evolution is not a theory, it is a natural phenomenon that can be observed, recorded, and measured. Theories are explanations for natural phenomena. When scientists approach the world, as we saw in the last chapter, they attempt to explain what they observe. The observation here is evolution. The explanation is Darwin's theory of natural selection. Darwin came up with an idea from his observations that in each generation more offspring were born than could survive to adulthood and reproduce. This is true for all manner of living things. For example, spiders. There are female spiders that can produce an egg sac every 2 weeks in which 1,000 spiders hatch. Each of those spiders can themselves reproduce. Half of them, 500 of them, are female. In a couple of weeks they can start producing as well. We would be up to over our heads in nothing but spiders if they could all survive and reproduce. There must be limits somehow. Within those limits, he assumed that there must be a kind of competition for resources and ultimately for reproductive success. He wrote, "It at once struck me that under these circumstances, favorable variations would tend to be preserved and unfavorable ones to be destroyed. That is, those individuals who had traits that gave them an advantage over others would be the ones most likely to reproduce and pass those traits on to the next generation." Processes of natural selection are the key to understanding evolution. Once Darwin understood how selection occurs in nature, he outlined the processes. We will now look at those processes. Darwin formulated his theory of natural selection based on his observations and influences of other thinkers of his day. After having read an essay by Thomas Malthus, an economist and clergyman, he generalized Malthus's idea that humans had the tendency to reproduce faster than their food supply could reproduce, to the recognition that all living things have a tendency towards overproduction. He further recognized that there is biological variation within all species. So, in each generation, it appears more individuals can be produced than can survive, and because of limited resources, this would result in a kind of competition. This isn't necessarily an open fight or battle against one or another, but simply more successful and less successful utilization of these resources. This results as a kind of competition among individuals. Fourth, individuals possessing favorable variations or traits, some might be faster, more resistant to diseases, have protective coloration that helps protect them from predators. They may have an advantage over those who lack those traits. That is, they would have greater fitness because favorable traits would increase the likelihood of survival and reproduction. The fifth point is that the environmental context determines whether or not a trait is beneficial. It isn't a matter of overall good traits and bad traits. It's a matter of traits that are favorable given the conditions of the environment. So favorable traits become more advantageous as a result of a natural process. 6. Traits are inherited and passed on to the next generation. Individuals who produce more offspring are said to have a greater reproductive success or fitness. So if their traits increase their probability of reproducing, those same traits will be passed on in greater numbers to following generations. Variations accumulate over long periods of time, so later generations may be distinct from ancestral ones. As populations respond to pressures over time, they may become distinct species descended from a common ancestor. This is the basic outline of Darwin's theory of natural selection as an explanation for evolutionary change and the development of new species. Over long periods of geological time, successful variations accumulate in a population. Later generations may be distinct from ancestral ones, or a new species can appear. These are the basic outcomes of natural selection. Darwin also recognized that geographical isolation through distance, natural barriers such as oceans and mountain ranges, can contribute to the formation of new species as individuals begin to adapt to different environments. If different populations of the same species are responding to different environmental conditions, their evolutionary courses will vary from one another. Selective pressures are the differential ecological circumstances. These cause distinct species to develop. See, for example, the 13 species of Galapagos finches, which we presume are all descended from a common South American ancestor. Some more details about evolutionary change through natural selection. At this point, you should recognize that a trait must be inherited if natural selection is going to act on it. Traits that aren't inherited aren't going to have an effect in the evolutionary course of a species or single population within a species. 2. Natural selection can't occur without population variation in inherited characteristics. If all individuals are exactly the same, then there's going to be no reason for differential reproductive success. 3. Fitness is a relative measure that changes as the environment changes. For example, which is a better or more fit bear, a white polar bear or a California brown bear? The question makes no sense. Neither are better than the other. They are both suited for different environmental conditions. A brown bear against a snowy background would stand out and be seen quite easily, say by, in the case of polar bears, which at times were hunted by Eskimos, a brown bear would be much easier to spot. The lighter fur, that is less heavy fur of the brown bear, would make it difficult for it to live in such a cold environment. A polar bear would stand out in the brown hills of California, as well as being way too hot with that thick, heavy coat of fur. Natural selection can only act on traits that affect reproduction, so there must be variation. That variation has to result in different reproductive successes and therefore change over time as some traits become more common, some traits become less common in a population. Fitness then in terms of natural selection is a measure of relative reproductive success of individuals. It isn't necessarily stronger, bigger, or healthier. It is simply able to reproduce more offspring on average. Fitness can be measured by an individual's genetic contribution to the next generation compared to that of other individuals. Some more important concepts. Fertility. This is the ability to conceive and produce healthy offspring. An animal that gives birth to more young passes its genes on at a faster rate than one that bears few offspring. However, the number of young raised successfully to the point of where they reproduce is also important. This is the differential net reproductive success. That is, to have 30 offspring and only 3 survive to reproduce does not confer greater fitness than the ability to have 5 offspring, all of which survive and reproduce. Genome. With the discovery of the structure of the DNA molecule came the understanding of the entire genetic makeup of an individual or species. The human and chimpanzee genomes were sequenced in 2003 and 2005, respectively. We share about 98% of our DNA with chimpanzees, our closest relatives. Biological continuity refers to a biological continuum. When expressions of a phenomenon continuously grade into one another so that there are no discrete categories, they exist in a continuum. We human beings are part of the biological continuum. Color is a phenomenon that exists in continuum. Life forms are another. Most people hold to belief systems that don't emphasize this or offer scientific explanations. We tend to see ourselves as distinct and separate from the rest of the living world. This is a potentially dangerous point of view that endangers both ourselves and other living organisms on this planet. We'll discuss that in more detail in class. Why it matters? One of the greatest controversies regarding education in the United States is the teaching of evolution. Understanding evolution makes a difference. We will discuss that in more detail in class as well. For now, here's an example. The H1N1 flu viruses are the result of viruses evolving or changing in form. Medical researchers try to predict which of several strains will pose the most serious threat and try to develop a vaccine that targets a specific evolving strain. The Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, Georgia is charged with this task. Unfortunately, this year you may have noted that you or others you know may have gotten a flu vaccination and still got the flu. Sadly, and beyond our control, the dominant virus for this particular season mutated very early in the season and became a form that was not very well affected by the vaccine. Our immune systems weren't, in a sense, programmed to fight the new virus. If future physicians and researchers don't understand evolution, there's little hope that they can forestall potential medical crises, as the pace of change in pathogens exceeds that of the antibiotics designed to defeat them. We'll discuss this more in class as well. So there are contemporary health challenges. The inevitable outcome of our more aggressive methods to fight microbes, these are disease-causing microorganisms such as bacteria and viruses, will lead to modified microorganisms that have evolved to resist therapies such as antibiotics. More use of antibiotics to treat bacterial infections weed out the vulnerable microbes but leave the less vulnerable ones to reproduce. Less vulnerable microbes may cause more serious forms of disease than the organisms that were eliminated. The potential of, in a sense, creating what are sometimes called superbugs is a real concern. We will discuss this as well in class. I hope to see you all the following week. Goodbye.